Morning, Kingsway. Wasn't that nice? Let's give Ed a little thank you. Yeah. You know, when I was younger and I had to get up in the morning, my dad would sing a song that he inherited from his mother. Arise and shine and give God the glory, glory. But after this Christmas season, I'm really feeling the writer of the book of Hebrews that says, enter that rest. How many of you know what I'm talking about? Wonderful. Well, let's read our passage for this morning. I was trying to think of a sermon that would go in between Christmas and New Year's, and I thought, well, you know, you start off the year preaching the gospel, and so you should. And one of the themes of that is being gentle with who we're speaking to. So let us read from 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 1 to 8. You know, brothers and sisters, that our visit to you is not without results. We had previously suffered and been treated outrageously in Philippi, as you know. But with the help of our God, we dared to tell you his gospel in the face of strong opposition. For the appeal we make does not spring from error or impure motives, nor are we trying to trick you. On the contrary, we speak as those approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel. We are not trying to please people, but God who tests our hearts. You know, we never use flattery, nor did we put on a mask to cover up greed. God is our witness. We were not looking for praise from any human being, not from you or anyone else. Even though as apostles of Christ, we could have asserted our rights. Instead, we were like young children among you. Just as a nursing mother cares for her children, so we cared for you. Because we loved you so much, we were delighted to share with you not only the gospel of God, but our lives as well. In the 2003 movie Luther, depicting the life and struggle of the German Protestant reformer Martin Luther, the character of his mentor, Johann von Staupitz, encourages Luther to go to Wittenberg to study the Bible. But Luther has enormous doubts about his ability to be a preacher. I think he'd be a fraud. But von Staupitz says in his fatherly, reassuring voice, we preach best what we need to learn most. And it's in that spirit that this morning's sermon about gentleness, which is a quality lacking in those intellectuals and scholars who, you know, I have friends that are often, you know, quite patient and will suffer a lot of foolishness, but if they're given the opportunity to write or debate or criticize, you know, the full rage will come out in wit and satire and insult and full sort of bully-like prowess. I have friends. Now, the selection of the passage from the Apostle Paul's first letter to the Thessalonians, which is our earliest Christian document, coming from around the early 50s. It's actually the first thing that we have written by a Christian. Was inspired, like the selection of the passage was inspired by a encounter with a good friend of mine who was at the church called Carrubbers Christian Center, which was the church I was attending while in Scotland. And he sat me down to lunch, and he pointed this passage out to me. And he sort of admonished me in his own sort of gentle and subtle way, take it easy on some of these other students here. Don't overburden them with knowledge. Don't flaunt your intellect. And please don't pose questions that they be not ready to ask you and more worry them than comfort them or help them. Now, rarely does such a beautifully simple thing come to me. And so this is sort of just a thank you to him and to say that, you know, his example was an embodiment of this very passage. Now, when we come to the Apostle Paul, we often have a vision of him as this very strong, zealous, very masculine kind of man. And he often presents himself, you know, as someone who in his former life tried to destroy the church of God. He portrays himself as a militant. That word should have different connotations for you now. And of course, it may have only been natural that some of his zeal would cross over into his new mission with the nations. And yet we have this same zealous, strong, bold man, not feared to dare to tell you God's gospel in the face of strong opposition, portraying himself as a female, as a caring, nurturing, motherly figure. And what is even more interesting is that he lists this characteristic of his ministry as a credential. He's saying, this is part of my conduct, and this is kind of what part of my authority goes to. And as we go through this passage, learning some aspects of how to be gentle and when to be gentle and what it means to be a witness of the gospel in our world, for now that God has come in the manger, what else shall we do? We shall find that the reason for this gentleness is not to put a smiling face on a threat, but to be the very embodiment and imitation of God in and toward the world. Now, Paul in this letter, unlike most of his other letters, is not listing his profile as an apostle in order to defend it. In some of his other letters, his sort of status is being contended for, and he has to argue for his position. Not in this letter. This letter, he lists his conduct of himself and his colleagues in order to explain how the great experiment of church in Thessalonica, how it was so successful. He was just recounting how they were made famous in Macedonia and throughout the rest of the empire. And how did this happen? And Paul is recounting his conduct as part of that. You know, brothers and sisters, that our visit to you was not without results. We had previously suffered and been treated outrageously in Philippi, as you know. But with the help of our God, we dare to tell you his gospel in the face of strong opposition. So the first of matters that Paul brings up is the subject of what he is willing to endure and for what he is willing to endure. What we should learn firstly about being gentle is that it involves picking your battles and to keep a singular purpose. If one is fighting many different battles at once, it'll be all the more difficult to be gentle, for one's posture toward the world will be aggression and battling. The mentality of me against the world is not the attitude Paul approaches his ministry with. And in our time, the Christian church can have such a gloom and doom attitude about the world that it feels it has to fight on any and all battleground for the Christian worldview, or whatever that might mean. Everything from music and politics, etc., which at the end of the day, these quibbles and whatnot are just distractions. If one is stuck in fighting many different battles, it will be difficult to be gentle to anyone when the time is needed. Paul picks his battle as the gospel, and for that he will endure much conflict and fight. And even in those occasions within his letters when he's not very gentle, like when he's disputing with Peter, or, he wishes that the party of circumcision would cut a certain important body piece off themselves. He is fighting for the gospel of reconciliation. And within our own lives, it becomes almost a discipline to learn how to struggle and when to pick battles and when to go in. When people at my own workplace, my own experience right now, hear that I desire to go into ministry and that the Bible is what I had studied, they take it as an opportunity to sort of voice any opinions that they have concerning religion and faith. And on the one hand, I really, really appreciate that. They know that I'm not out there to dog them, or they know that I'm not going to push them and annoy them. On the other hand, what it means is I have to endure quite a lot of foolishness of some of the stuff that they talk about. And here are some quotes of some of the things that I listen to, and I put on a smiling face just so that I could have the opportunity one day to share the gospel with them. Stalin is one of my personal heroes. That's going to haunt me one day. If someone wanted to trash my character, they could take that out of my sermon and say, look what he said. It's going to be terrible. The Bible was written 500 years after it occurred. And my personal favorite. Obviously, Ruth and Naomi were having sex. The speech Ruth gave to Naomi is used at weddings. And each time I have to remind myself, pick your battles, pick your battles. And what I want to encourage you with firstly in gentleness is if you pick the singular battle of the gospel, you will have the energy to endure and be gentle in all other matters when dealing with the ignorant or the right-out hostile. So you have the opportunity to share the gospel with them. For as a Christian, you will have enough enemies in this world without making any of your own unnecessarily through harshness or aggression. For the appeal we make does not spring from error or impure motives, nor are we trying to trick you. On the contrary, we speak as those approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel. We are not trying to please people but God, who tests our hearts. Paul goes on to argue that because he is willing to endure such things, that he and his colleagues are sincere. Sincerity is a virtue in a world of manipulation. And we shouldn't disparage sincerity. I think a lot of time we disparage sincerity because you can be sincerely wrong. Now, sincerity is important because it speaks to the fact of whether one's own character in life has been shaped by the message one is giving. Of all the important events throughout church history, we can be sure that one thing is true. Like Paul himself, the men and women who delivered the message, whether they were right or wrong, were sincere in their beliefs. They were not running an advertising campaign. They were not trying to jaw up their numbers. They were not trying to promote a book. They were delivering the gospel of reconciliation with their lives. And if it's one thing that we know, no one dies for what they know is a lie. They sincerely believe this to be true. These men and women were not lying to you when they proclaimed that they believed that they had met the resurrected Lord. And if they are going to be listened to, they will be listened to on that basis alone. Another sign of the Apostle Paul's sincerity is his bold proclamation of the gospel is not incentivized. In another sermon, I've mentioned the danger of incentivizing the gospel. Believe in Jesus and you'll be rich. Call on the Lord and you'll be happy. Or belief in the Christian faith is the most rational thing to do. Because all these things, take on an add-on, and then what they really want is that add-on at the end of the day. And if that fails, then they abandon the whole ship. Paul did not preach a message to make it palatable, and nor should we. Because if you make a message that's palatable, it means we're more concerned with pleasing them than necessarily loving them. To give something palatably deceitful, which will fall under the cares of the world, is actually less gentle than giving something as graciously as one can, but maybe difficult and hard to bear, but built on the firm foundation of truth, because in the short season the lie will sustain, but when it crashes it will result in the loss of hope. Which is probably one of the harshest things you could do to a person, is take away their hope in this world. We never use flattery, nor do we put on a mask to cover up greed. God is our witness. We were not looking for praise from any human being, not from you or anyone else, even though, as apostles of Christ, we could have asserted our rights. Paul further elaborates upon his sincerity by also adding that he did not come with a pretext for greed. Why does Paul need to mention this in particular? Well, in our earliest literature about the Christians, we could see that the Christians were such an expansive and generous movement, the legacy of which is continued within our own church, we can see with Stonegate and Maybell and elsewhere, that this early community was so generous that they had to create regulations for the welfare that they gave to their community because it could be so easily taken advantage of. The Christians are, in some sense, the precursor to the welfare state. The early Christians in the first few centuries of the church had such a society that would share resources that inevitably there were those that were willing to take but were not willing to contribute to it. We call these people freeloaders. And we have a story of such a freeloader, a guy named Peregrinus Proteus. He's a Greek philosopher in the 2nd century who goes to Palestine and eventually rises up to the rank of a bishop. And he's thrown in jail, and he takes advantage of the Christians' kindness throughout his time in jail. And this is elaborated on by his biographer in the 2nd century, a guy named Lucian. And Lucian, in connection to Peregrinus, says of the Christians, "The activity of these people in dealing with any matter that affects their community is something extraordinary. They spare no trouble, no expense. Peregrine all this time was making quite an income on the strength of his bondage. Money came pouring in. You see, these misguided creatures start with the general conviction that they are immortal for all time, which explains the contempt of death and the voluntary self-devotion which are so common among them. And then it was impressed on them by their original lawgiver that they are all brothers from the moment they are converted and deny the gods of Greece and worship the crucified sage and live after his laws. All this they take quite on trust, with the result that they despise all worldly goods alike, regarding them as mere common property. Now, an unscrupulous fellow who has seen the world has only to get among these simple souls, and his fortune is pretty soon made. He plays with them." It is in this kind of environment that Paul elaborates that he did not take advantage of the kindness of his community. He was not greedy for their wealth or resources. For to impose the collection of resources from someone or on a group of people inevitably results in hostility. And in Paul, in desiring to be gentle with his message, siphons nothing from the community of which they cannot bear. Further, not only does he not take from them, but he does not take from them even when he could. Paul in this letter reminds his readers that he could exert his rights as an apostle, but is choosing not to. And it is here where we have to tackle sort of one particular trouble with gentleness in the way sometimes gentleness is understood in society, and it has to do with how to be a gentle leader. See, the cynical way to read what Paul is doing here is saying, I have the hand to slap you with, but I'm not going to use it, but know that I have it. Right? It's a threat with a smile. It's a very difficult sort of conundrum. Because one of the most well-known sort of manipulative tactics used by those in power who do have a mask to cover up their greed or are trying to please people is to pacify the anger of the victim in the situation with a gentle approach. You know, in studies concerning like dangerous religious cults, this is what's known as love bombing, where you are gentle and kind enough to the person so that they will accept your enslavement of them. You know, the well-known figure in history of the kind slave master who, while owning slaves, you know, he gives them hot water, they sleep in his house, so it's not that bad. At least he's not really harsh with them. Or, you know, a little more provocatively, a sort of modern example, which we have in the 2012 film Zero Dark 30, is the torture master that understands the difficult relationship they've been put in. The film, if you haven't seen it, is depicting the capture of Osama bin Laden. And one of the most disturbing things about this movie, if you've ever seen it or if you are going to see it, is there's a CIA agent, and he is portrayed waterboarding one of his subjects in the chamber. And 5 minutes later, he's trying to joke with the guy and smoke cigars with him. The torture master, who's your friend? Just pretending like the violence never occurred, separates it out from the roles. He's a torture master, but he understands that this guy is also a person, and he's friendly to him, and so forth. It's this kind of gentleness, this sort of facade that's meant to keep this sort of unequal relationship. But is Paul's form of leadership here that? In this letter, he doesn't have to contend for his leadership, and that's not what he's doing. His leadership, and the kind that we find with God, is what I would call a gentleness of introduction. As any good teacher or scholar eventually learns, if you begin with the most difficult lessons, the students will never reach the full understanding. But if you lead them gently, lesson by lesson, step by step, they will come into a fuller knowledge of that which they may not have been able to understand. It is gently introducing something which, if you were to start off, would actually be very, very difficult to accept. Instead, we were like young children among you. Just as a nursing mother cares for her children, so we cared for you. Because we loved you so much, we were delighted to share with you not only the gospel of God, but our lives as well. So at the end of this passage, Paul contrasts his ministry of gentleness with all the other approaches. And he describes himself and his colleagues both as children and as a mother. He kind of has this weird switch of metaphor, but it's nevertheless very apt. Now, gentleness, for the theme of this passage, comes from an interesting variant that we have in Greek manuscripts concerning verse 7. It says, "Instead, we were like young children among you." And in the best estimation, it is supposed to read children, ne pioi. But in a good strain of manuscripts, it reads gentle, he pioi. It's a one-letter difference. So Paul is describing his ministry as being as gentle as children, and yet as a leader, as a mother that introduces her children to the world. And it is here, in depicting himself as a mother, introducing her children to the world, that we can see God's gentleness in its fullest form as a gentleness of introduction into a relationship. Rather than the gentleness that preserves a sort of status of power, the gentleness of God, the gentleness of introduction, is a kind that gives up rights and needs and all else that may be necessary for the love and transformation of the other person. To sort of sum it all up in a way of like 1 Corinthians 13 with love, we could say, gentleness does not enter into needless conflicts, for it knows that much is to be suffered already. Gentleness is sincere, without guile or pretense or flattery, for it knows that the cost of manipulation is mistrust. Gentleness does not impose a collection of resources upon whom it seeks to love, for it knows that taxation is never asked by love. Gentleness does not exert its own rights or its own power as a mask, for it knows that love is given in the sharing of our very selves. Before we close our time together and the worship team leads us in another song, we have sought to look at Paul's example of gentleness, about how to share the gospel for this upcoming year. And we would be remiss if we did not see how this approach is an embodiment of the very message that it seeks to give. We have just come from reflecting upon the advent of God, and how, as the hymn says, all the hopes and fears of all the years are met in thee tonight. And it is here where we have met a mercy and gentleness so overwhelming that we cannot believe that we have been given it. The gentleness of God is found most beautifully in the notion of forgiveness. The notion that God would be willing to suffer for everything for the single purpose of defeating sin and death. That God came without any pretense of a king, flattery of a politician, or deceit of a salesman. That God did not ask anything of us or impose a burden of holiness upon us before we could approach him. And that God did not think of godhood as something to be grasped onto, but let go of his own power and status in the incarnation as a baby, so that we could be approached gently as we are introduced to the kingdom of God with a grace that overwhelms the soul. Now, if you have any questions about this gospel, feel free to talk to myself or any of the other church leaders or whoever you may feel comfortable with asking about it. To give more of a sense of this sort of overwhelming gentleness, I'm going to read a passage from what has become now one of my favorite books, The Brothers Karamazov by Fyodor Dostoevsky. And one of the characters, Dmitri, who's one of the brothers, is put on trial for murdering his father. And it appears from all accounts that he's guilty. And without spoiling the richness of the novel or its ending, it can be sure that his lawyer is in a tough position. So much so that near the end of his speech, he proposes that even the accused were to be found guilty, that forgiving him would be better than condemning him, as it would save his soul. Now, in closing, I'm just going to read a passage from this lawyer's speech. I'm going to adapt it only slightly. And then once I close, the worship team will lead us out in our closing song. And if this is true of the justice of a court system, imagine how more it is of God toward us. Gentlemen and ladies of the jury, lo, we shall condemn him, and he will say to himself, these men did nothing for my fortunes, for my upbringing, my education, in order to make me better, to make me a man. These men did not feed me, did not give me to drink, nor did they visit me as I lay naked in prison. And now they have sent me into penal servitude. I am quits with them. I owe them nothing now, and shall owe no one anything until the end of the ages. They are wicked, and I shall be wicked. They are cruel, and I shall be cruel. That is what he will say. And I swear, with your accusation, you will only relieve him, relieve his conscience. He will continue to curse the blood he has spilt and will have no remorse for it. At the same time, you will bring to ruin the man still possible within him, for he will remain wicked and blind all the rest of his days. But do you wish to punish him terribly, ferociously, with the most dreadful punishment that one may imagine, but with the purpose of saving and regenerating his soul forever? If so, then overwhelm him with your gentleness. You will see, you will hear his soul shudder and show horror. Am I to endure this? How am I to receive all this love? How am I worthy of it? That is what he will exclaim. Oh, I know this heart, this wild but noble heart. It will bow down before your pious deed. It will thirst for a great act of love. It will burn aloft and be resurrected forever. There are souls that in their limitation accuse the entire world, but overwhelm this soul with mercy. Show it love and it will curse its handiwork, for within it there are so many good beginnings. The soul will grow enlarged and will behold how merciful God is, how fair and just. He will be horrified and crushed by repentance and the numberless dead that stands before him from this day. And then what he will say is not, I am quits with them, but I am guilty before all men, and I'm the most unworthy of all men. Praise God.